Hello, and welcome back to Dreamtime Stories. I'm Hattie, and I'm delighted you've returned. Tonight, I have a mysterious tale for you, set amongst the mists and tides of a small English seaside village. It's a story of hidden identities and candlelit secrets, of a man who travels in search of deception and finds instead something far more complicated than he anticipated. This is a gentle mystery, one where the line between truth and illusion is not always clear, and where the most carefully kept secrets are sometimes the most understandable. There are shadows here, and whispers, and the sound of the sea beyond the window. But there is also warmth and candlelight, and the quiet understanding that some truths, when finally revealed, ask more of us than simple judgment. So, settle yourself deeply into comfort, let your breath slow and deepen, and allow this story to carry you into that quiet space between waking and dreaming. There's nothing to solve, nothing to remember. Just listen and drift. Our tale is called Beyond the Candlelight. The village of Thornhaven clung to the Devonshire coast like something that had grown there naturally, as much a part of the landscape as the grey rocks and the salt-bleached grasses that lined the cliff tops. Its streets were narrow and winding, its cottages small and weather-worn, their whitewashed walls stained by decades of sea spray. The harbour at the village's heart held a handful of fishing boats that rose and fell with the tide, their masts tracing slow arcs against the pale winter sky. Mr. Frederick Marsh arrived on the afternoon coach from Exeter, his leather bag containing a notebook, 2 changes of linen, and a healthy skepticism towards everything he was about to encounter. He was a journalist of some 8 years' standing, employed by the Illustrated London Recorder, and he had been sent to Thornhaven with a specific purpose. There had been reports passed along through the quiet channels by which such things travelled, of an unusual medium operating in the village, a woman who held séances in the vicarage parlour, who claimed to speak with the departed, and whose sessions had attracted considerable attention from the surrounding villages and towns. His editor had been characteristically direct. The paper had published 3 exposés of fraudulent mediums in the past 2 years, each one well received by a readership increasingly fascinated by the question of spiritualism. Frederick was to attend a session, observe carefully, identify the methods of deception being employed, and return with enough material for a thorough and damning account. Frederick had no particular objection to the assignment. He had attended enough séances in London to find them tedious rather than troubling, their tricks transparent to anyone who looked carefully enough. Table rapping, mysterious lights, voices from beyond. All of it explicable, all of it designed to exploit the grief of people who had lost someone they loved and would pay considerable sums for the comfort of believing they might speak with them again. He found the whole business distasteful, and the prospect of exposing another practitioner of it held no moral difficulty for him whatsoever. The inn where he was to stay stood at the top of the harbour road, its sign creaking in the sea wind. The landlady, a stout woman with an air of comfortable authority, showed him to a room overlooking the water. The window was salt-clouded, and through it the sea looked grey and restless, The horizon blurred where it met the sky. Frederick stood for a moment looking out, listening to the sound of the waves below. There was something about the sea that always quieted his mind, even when it was in this mood, dark and shifting and impossible to read. He spent the remainder of the afternoon acquainting himself with the village. It was a small place, perhaps 200 souls in total, the kind of community where a stranger's arrival was noted and discussed before he had gone 50 yards from the inn. He visited the harbour, spoke briefly with a fisherman mending nets in the thin afternoon light, and found his way eventually to the village church, a modest Norman building surrounded by a churchyard where the headstones leaned at various angles, worn smooth by the salt wind. The vicarage stood adjacent to the church, separated from it by a low stone wall and a garden that in summer would presumably be pleasant, but in the grey December light looked austere and a little melancholy. It was a larger building than Frederick had expected, 2 stories of pale stone with a wide front door and generous windows. Lamplight glowed in the downstairs rooms, warm against the fading afternoon. The vicar, he had been told, was a Reverend Alderton, a widower of some years who had in his grief turned increasingly towards questions of the spirit and the afterlife. It was he who had first invited the medium to Thornhaven, and he who provided her with the use of his parlour for her sessions. The arrangement had apparently suited both parties. The Reverend received the comfort of believing he maintained some connection to his late wife. The medium received a respectable address from which to conduct her work and a degree of social credibility that would have been difficult to obtain elsewhere. Frederick returned to the inn as the light failed, ate a supper of good plain food, and spent the evening reviewing his notes from previous investigations. The session at the vicarage was arranged for the following evening. He had secured his invitation through a letter of introduction, provided by a London acquaintance who was known to the Reverend, presenting himself simply as a gentleman with an interest in spiritual matters. It was not strictly honest, but Frederick had long since made his peace with the small deceits that investigative journalism sometimes required. He slept well, despite the wind off the sea, which found its way around the edges of the inn windows and filled the room with a low, persistent sound that was not quite a whistle and not quite a moan, but something between the two. He had expected it to keep him awake. Instead, he found it strangely soothing, like a voice telling him that the world beyond the window was vast and indifferent, and that his small concerns were nothing against the age of the sea. The next morning was clear, the storm of the previous night having blown itself out some time before dawn. Frederick walked along the cliff-top path after breakfast, his coat pulled close against the cold. The sea below was still agitated, waves breaking white against the rocks, but the sky above was a pale, washed blue, and the air tasted of salt and something indefinably clean. He found himself thinking, not for the first time, that he understood why people chose to live in places like this, so far from the noise and complexity of London. In the village, he made careful inquiries. He spoke with the woman who ran the small shop near the harbour, ostensibly interested in purchasing provisions for his stay. She was, as he had hoped, forthcoming on the subject of the medium. The woman called herself Madame Isolde, which was almost certainly not her real name. She had arrived in Thornhaven perhaps 18 months previously, taking lodgings in one of the cottages near the church. She was quiet, kept largely to herself, was always polite and always paid her bills on time. The sessions at the vicarage had begun perhaps a year ago, initially for the Reverend alone, then gradually expanding to include a small circle of regular attendees. Frederick noted all of this in his book, adding to it further details gathered from the landlady at the inn and from a brief conversation with the sexton who tended the churchyard. What emerged was a picture of a woman who had established herself carefully and quietly, causing no disruption, attracting no ill feeling. This was unusual in Frederick's experience. The fraudulent mediums he had investigated previously had tended to be more aggressive in their methods, more obvious in their ambitions. They sought larger audiences, higher fees, greater drama. Madame Isolde, by contrast, seemed content with her small circle and her modest existence. He arrived at the vicarage that evening at 7 o'clock, as instructed. The Reverend himself opened the door, a tall, thin man in his 60s, with a kind face and eyes that held the particular quality of someone who had been sad for a long time and had found a way to live alongside their sadness. He welcomed Frederick warmly, clearly pleased to have a visitor from London, and led him through a hallway that smelled of beeswax and old books into the parlour at the rear of the house. The room had been arranged with care. 6 chairs were placed in a circle around a circular table covered with a dark cloth. Candles stood in holders at intervals around the room, their light soft and warm, casting long shadows against the walls. A fire burned low in the grate. On a sideboard, a bowl of dried flowers gave off a faint, sweet scent that mingled with the candle smoke and the smell of the sea, which found its way even here, through the walls and the windows and the very stones of the building. 4 other guests were already present. Frederick studied them with the practiced eye of a man whose profession required him to read people quickly. There was an elderly couple from a neighbouring village, their faces bearing the careful blankness of people trying not to show how much they hoped. There was a younger woman, perhaps 30, whose dark dress and quiet manner suggested recent bereavement, and there was a man of about Frederick's own age, a solicitor from Exeter by the look of him, who sat slightly apart from the others with an expression of polite curiosity. Madame Isolde entered the room last. Frederick had formed expectations during his inquiries, and she confounded all of them. He had anticipated someone theatrical, someone who understood that the business of appearing otherworldly required a certain performance. Instead, the woman who took her seat at the head of the table was quietly, almost severely dressed in deep grey with no ornament. She was perhaps 40, perhaps a little older, with dark hair pulled back simply, and a face that was striking rather than conventionally beautiful. Her eyes, when they moved across the assembled group in brief acknowledgement, were of an unusual colour, somewhere between green and grey, the colour of the sea on an overcast day. She said very little before the session began. She thanked them for coming, asked that they remain still and quiet, and requested that the candles at the far end of the room be extinguished, leaving only those nearest the table burning. Then she closed her eyes folded her hands in her lap, and was still. Frederick watched with the careful attention he brought to all such occasions, his mind already cataloguing the elements of the room and noting the possibilities they offered for trickery. The remaining candles were positioned to cast light upward onto faces and to leave the corners of the room in shadow. The tablecloth reached to the floor on all sides. The chairs were placed close enough that hands might touch in the darkness without being seen to move. All standard arrangements, all familiar. What was not familiar was the quality of the silence that settled over the room. Frederick had attended perhaps a dozen séances in his professional capacity, and all of them had involved a period of enforced quiet before the medium began to perform. But this silence was different. It had a texture to it, a density, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The fire had burned so low that it gave almost no sound. The candles barely flickered. Even the sea, which had been audible from every point in the village, seemed to recede, as if withdrawing to a respectful distance. He became aware, after some time that might have been 5 minutes or 15, that Madame Isolde was speaking, not loudly, and not with any of the theatrical intonation he had come to associate with fraudulent mediums. She spoke quietly, almost conversationally, as if relaying messages she was half hearing herself. She addressed the elderly couple, mentioning details that caused the wife to press her hand to her mouth. She spoke to the young woman in black, who sat very still, and then nodded once, slowly, as if something had been confirmed that she had long suspected. Frederick watched for the mechanics of it, the cold reading techniques he knew, the ways in which a skilled operator could gather information from the subtle signals of face and body, from prior inquiry, from the small details of dress and manner. He saw nothing he could definitively identify, which did not mean, he reminded himself firmly, that nothing was there. It meant only that she was better at concealing it than most. When she spoke to him, he was caught off guard. She had turned to him without warning, her unusual eyes opening and settling on his face with a directness that was unsettling in its steadiness. She did not offer the names of departed relatives or the vague comforts she had provided to the others. She was quiet for a moment, regarding him with those sea-coloured eyes. When she finally spoke, what she offered him was not comfort, nor the name of someone departed. It was something quieter than that, and considerably more unsettling. It was a meaningless statement, Frederick told himself afterwards. The kind of thing that could apply to anyone, that the listener would fill with their own significance. And yet he found he could not quite dismiss it, could not file it away as cleanly as he had filed away every other such statement he had heard in the course of his investigations. After the session ended and the other guests had departed, Frederick lingered. He told the Reverend that he had found the evening deeply affecting, which was not entirely untrue, and asked whether it might be possible to speak briefly with Madame Isolde before she left. The Reverend, pleased by his evident interest, went to inquire. Madame Isolde agreed to speak with him. They sat in the parlour after the Reverend had retired, the candles burning lower now, the fire rebuilt to a comfortable warmth. She poured tea from a pot that had appeared from the kitchen, and they sat on either side of the hearth in the manner of two people who had known each other for some time, which they had not. Frederick had intended to be direct. He had intended to present his credentials, explain his purpose, and observe how she responded. Instead, he found himself speaking about the session, about the quality of the silence, about the elderly couple and the young woman in black. And as he spoke, he found himself watching her face with the same attention he had applied during the session itself, looking not for tricks this time, but for something else, something he could not quite name. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire. Then she said, in a voice that had lost whatever professional quality it had held during the session and become simply a voice, a woman's voice, tired and careful, that she supposed he had come to write about her. Frederick acknowledged that he had. She nodded slowly, as if this were no more than she had expected. She asked him what he had found. He told her honestly that he had found nothing he could definitively call deception, that the methods she used, if she used methods, were beyond his ability to identify on a single evening's observation, that he had come expecting to find something transparent and had found instead something he did not know how to account for. She looked at him then, directly, with those sea-coloured eyes, and he had the distinct impression that she was making a decision. What she told him came out slowly, over the course of perhaps an hour, while the candles burned and the fire settled and the sea resumed its distant conversation with the shore. Her name was not Isolde, had never been Isolde. She had been born Millicent Vane, the daughter of a solicitor in Bristol, a respectable family in a respectable street. She had married young, at 19, to a man considerably older than herself, a man whose respectability had proved to be as carefully constructed as anything she herself now practiced. The marriage had been, in the language of the time, difficult. There were debts, concealed before the wedding and revealed after it, with a casualness that suggested they had always been expected to become her problem. There was a temper, controlled in company, and less so at home. There were years of managing, of making the best of things, of the particular exhaustion that comes from perpetually adjusting one's own reality to accommodate someone else's version of it. And then there had been an accusation. Her husband, facing the final collapse of his finances, had told his creditors and his family and anyone else who would listen that the fault lay with his wife, that money had been mismanaged, that she had spent what she had not earned and hidden what she had. None of it was true. Frederick, listening, was quite certain of this, though he could not have said precisely why. Some truths had a quality to them that was distinct from performance, and this had it. She had left. Not with drama, not with announcement. She had simply, one ordinary morning, gathered what she could carry and departed, taking a coach to Exeter, and from there another to the coast, and in the first village that felt sufficiently removed from everything she had known, she had stopped. She had become Madame Isolde, had discovered that she had a gift for listening, for the particular kind of attention that allowed people to feel truly heard, and she had found a way to make that gift useful. Were the spirits real? Frederick asked when she had finished. She considered the question seriously. She did not know, she said. She had never known. She knew that when she sat in silence and opened herself to the room, she received impressions that she had not gathered through any means she could consciously identify. Whether those impressions came from somewhere beyond the physical world or from some capacity of her own mind that she did not understand, she genuinely could not say. She had stopped trying to explain it. She had found it was enough simply to do what she did, and to do it carefully, and to cause no harm. Frederick sat for a long time after she finished speaking. The last of the candles had burned very low, their flames small and steady in the still air. Through the vicarage windows, the sea was a presence rather than a sight, felt rather than seen, its rhythm as constant and reliable as breathing. He thought about what she had asked him, in her careful, indirect way, without quite asking. He thought about the elderly couple, and the young woman in black, and the Reverend with his quiet eyes and his long sadness. He thought about what Millicent Vane had built here, in this small village, on this particular stretch of coast, and what it would mean to dismantle it. He thought about what she had said during the session, the message she had claimed to receive for him, that the truth was not always a simple matter, that the most honest thing a person could do was sometimes to say nothing at all. Frederick returned to London 4 days later. He filed his copy on time, as he always did. His editor read it with interest and some puzzlement, and asked whether he had found sufficient evidence of fraudulent practice to satisfy the paper's legal requirements for publication. Frederick said that he had not. His editor looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and moved the papers to one side. Another assignment was found. The matter of Madame Isolde and the vicarage at Thornhaven was not mentioned again. Whether Millicent Vane continued her sessions in the candlelit parlour by the sea, Frederick did not know with certainty. He had not returned to Thornhaven and did not intend to. But he found himself sometimes, in the midst of the noise and urgency of London, thinking of that particular silence, the density of it, the way it had settled over the room like something with weight and intention. He found himself thinking of the sea sound returning after the session ended, as if it had been waiting politely outside. And he found himself thinking of her eyes, the colour of the sea on an overcast day, and the way she had looked at him when she made her decision to tell the truth to a man who had come to expose her, trusting that he would know what to do with it. He had known. He was not entirely sure, even now, whether he had made the right decision. But he had made the only one that felt honest, which was perhaps, in the end, the same thing. In Thornhaven, if one visited in the winter months and found one's way to the vicarage on the right evening, one might see the candlelight in the parlour window, warm and steady against the dark. The village had grown used to it, that particular glow, in the way that small communities grow used to the things that become part of their fabric. It was simply there, as the harbour was there, and the church, and the sound of the sea that accompanied everything in that place, never absent, never demanding, always present. Beyond the candlelight, in the room where the circle gathered, a woman who had once been someone else continued her quiet work. Whether what she did was real or not remained, as she herself had said, a question without a simple answer. But the people who came to her left lighter than they had arrived, and the candles burned steadily through the winter evenings, and the sea kept its own counsel, as it always had and always would.